Hello everybody, it's me, Beth Maitland from Drama Queen Bee Quilt Studio, and today we're going to talk about Cutter Quilt needle books. I have a few samples right here that I would like to flip through quickly and show you what we're going to do, but I think we're going to make one. So this is I used a little bit of quilting from a quilt that was damaged, and I did some wool felt page, a little piece of a serviette, which is a cloth napkin, a vintage cloth napkin I folded up and made a pocket. And that's a perfect place to tuck all kinds of little sewing goodies. And I used little scraps of tilde fabric on this one to make a binding. I did blanket stitch around the outside of the felt, and I put a little Liberty page, a little pocket on the back cover. You can see that I did all kinds of little additions of yo-yos and buttons and a motif of vintage lace. I did blanket stitch around the outside, and we're going to learn about a lot of those things today. This second one is another example of different ways that you can use similar items. So again, strips of just scrap fabric, some motifs and scraps of lace, little doilies, little tiny coaster-sized doilies, buttons and little pieces of trim you can add on for pieces of interest. That's a little lace motif, another yo-yo. Again, on the felted wool, the white is from Australia. It's a lovely Australian felted wool. You can do a blanket stitch around the outside, and then here's another serviette with pockets. I used just a raw edge binding of little strips, like under 1 inch, of the tiniest scraps of fabric to close the edges. And then again, here's another little piece of a serviette that I made a pocket out of. And then on the back, a little coaster doily. So that's number 2. Number 3, I tore up an old linen shirt and did embroidery of a little bullion, a lavender, and did this lovely embroidery that I added on top as just a scrap with some buttons that coordinate and some purple thread and the blanket stitch around the outside. And here's what my piece of cutter quilt looked like originally, adding on just little samples of things to embellish and make them interesting. Again, here's the white Australian wool with stitch around it, and this is just a piece of folded polka dots that I made a little pocket page out of. And another little yo-yo of tilde fabric on the back cover. And so there's all kinds of different ways that you can embellish these, and we're going to talk about some of those in a minute. Here's a bunch of yo-yos. I just sometimes sit in front of the television or whatever if I'm watching a movie and just make yo-yos all night. And here's a wild piece of a bright yellow coaster doily that's crocheted, and here's a tan one. And then again, just kind of coordinate the colors of threads. Here's another piece of serviette. I put a little lace underneath and folded over the rough edge, and then bound the outside edges to close the pockets, and then did a little running stitch in a contrasting thread, and I did a little bullion knot, a little floral element in the corner of our felt, and another pocket of Liberty fabric on the scrap on the back with lace. And these make really lovely gifts, or really lovely things to take with you to go when you're going to sewing classes or workshops or retreats. These are just a couple of little scraps of cutter quilt I had left over. I decided to make little tiny ones, and we're going to make a smaller size in our demo in just a few minutes. We're going to make a smaller sized one. But again, just using little scraps for binding around the outside edge on my pocket pages. And then just a little scrap of this beautiful Australian felted wool. And again, the pockets can be finished in lots of ways, even just folding it, or you can leave them raw edged. But here's a look at just that little scrap of cutter quilt. The tiniest scraps can make the loveliest little gift. I added charms on that one, and a little birdie charm on this one too. I just gather all this stuff. Broken jewelry, that's a little piece of vintage needlework from the corner of something. I'm like I said, make the yo-yos in batches. Out of all kinds of just little scraps. And this is just a little embroidered coaster. It's kind of thick, but it would hold needles and pins really well. So I just tucked that in the middle when I sewed them all down. And there's lovely ways of using even the smallest little scrap on these projects that we're going to make. So hopefully there's something interesting for you to learn to do in just a few minutes. Let's take a look. We start with a piece of cutter quilt. And I got my wool scrap, piece of serviette, and I just gathered some basic scraps to decide how I'm going to use those things to embellish. Here's another piece of serviette that's a little bit bigger to make my pocket page, and some embroidery pieces and lace pieces and little scrap. And again, you just gather what's around, and we're going to make something really pretty with it. I started with the inside and the cover. And what I do is I just pick a contrasting thread that I feel looks nice, and I do a blanket stitch on these around the whole outside edge. I really like the blanket stitch on these little tiny cutter quilts because all the quilting is already done. All the texture is already there. We don't have to do a layer of base fabric with batting underneath and then layer the collage and then line it. The scrap of quilt is already done for us, so we save a little time to start with. And so I'm going to pick this kind of raspberry variegated, beautiful pearl cotton, perlé, as the Australians say. We're going to, what I like to do is pull a piece out maybe longer than is comfortable if you're a beginner, but I try to avoid as many knots as possible in the process. So I get a really long piece to start with to go all the way with the blanket stitch around the whole outside, just to avoid any knots that show. If you have to, do several different threads and tie off, you're going to end up seeing those knots. So I go with probably a much bigger, longer piece of pearl cotton than is sensible, but it keeps me from having knots that show in my work. So we are going to thread this up, we're going to knot it, and then we're going to find a way to hide our knot. And because this is a cut edge to this little piece of quilting fabric, we can go in between the top and bottom layer and bury that knot in the batting. And I try to find where the spine is, where I'm going to fold it in half. And I start there in case I cut short and I do have to make knots, or in case the knot shows or pokes out. Doing it on the spine is a better sort of a hidden spot to do it. So we're going to find the center, top and bottom, and we're going to sort of take our needle and go in between the layers and bury it in the batting layer inside. And we're going to go in I use about 1/4 of an inch as a gauge, and then I bury that knot. And then I loop around all the way to the back to do my you know what, that little piece of ruffle is in my way, so I'm going to just nip that off, get that out of our way. So we go all the way over the top and we go in the back, coming through at the same place that our thread comes out the top layer. And I pull that all the way through. Again, a really long piece of thread for now, and then I take a little tuck at the top with my needle and I come back out over in the very, very top edge of my cover. And that creates a little bit of a knot and starts our blanket stitch. And then from now on, we just do a standard blanket stitch, which is going around all 4 sides. We loop the thread across the top and we take our needle in from the back. Again, I use about 1/4 of an inch. You can use what suits you, but I go in at about 1/4 of an inch and pull through and catch the long end. There we go. Catch the long end of my thread and make my pretty little piece across the top. The thread's so long at the beginning that it's a little bit hard to manage. So we come through from the back to the front, we catch that loop, and we pull it tight. Perfect. We come in from the back at about 1/4 of an inch down, we pull it through, and we catch that loop and pull it tight. Now I don't tug, try to relax. I don't tug too tight with this because it will start to pucker the fabric. So we want to just be relaxed with it, but pull it tight enough that it makes a firm stitch. So again, start from the back at about 1/4 of an inch down from the edge, from the back to the front, pull it through, catch that loop of the longer piece of thread and pull it taut. Perfect. Now, you can see that even from the back, we have a nice, if you try to be consistent, unless you want a really kind of rustic look, sort of a folk look, you can vary, it might be a quarter of an inch, it might be a little bit more, a little bit less, but then I tend, because these are pretty small projects, I tend to try to be kind of regimented and stick with about a quarter of an inch and make it kind of straight. So we're going to go around all four sides of this. I'm going to go off camera in just a second, finish it, and then come back. I use this blanket stitch. It is not a great stitch for holding seams together, for like if you're trying to do several layers that like a pocket, or that's going to hold something heavy. But it's a beautiful decorative stitch when it's just for decoration, and it makes this edge look finished. It's not required though. If you want to just leave a raw edge around your quilt, you can do that. If you want to just do an alternate, might be a running stitch, maybe a quarter of an inch in. If it's easier for you just to do a running stitch or a cantha stitch all the way around in a contrasting thread, you can do that. So this is all just whatever suits you, whatever pleases your eye, and whatever pleases the style you're going for. I love shabby chic. I love tattered edges. I love tearing fabric instead of cutting it to make the loose edges show in my work. But maybe you're a little more structured in your style and your aesthetic, and you want edges turned under. So then do that. Bind the entire outside edge around all four sides with like quilt binding, and make it a much more finished, proper, structured construction. But today, our little scrappy, using scraps and pieces project is going to be my shabby chic kind of aesthetic. So again, I'm going to sign off for just a minute. I'm going to finish all the way around. You don't need to see the same thing over and over again forever. So I'm gonna pop in, finish it, and pop back in just a few minutes for the next phase. Okay, I do exactly the same thing with my beautiful Australian wool, felted wool piece of needle page. What I'm showing you right now is that I like to hide my knots, and I'm going to put a little, remember those little clusters that we showed when I did the flip through just at the beginning of this video, making those little clusters of bullion knots that look like a little flower. I'm showing you how to do that now. I knot my thread. I just had a little extra left over that I wanted to use up before we blanket stitch around this. And I love French knots. I love making clusters of grapes, making clusters of wisteria, making clusters of lavender with French knots. I love French knots. They're so much fun to do, and they're so instant gratification and pretty. So what we do is we take our thread, our extra little scrap of thread, in from the top and use the knot as part of our design. And then I surround the knot of my thread with little French knots all the way around it. So this way I build up until I'm satisfied. And generally I find odd numbers or a lot of multiples is what makes the best looking cluster. But this is just a cluster of French knots from the front to the back. And again, in order to hide my knots and make this not messy, that I have to cover it with something on the back side, because this is just a single sheet of felted wool. I just hide my knots using it as part of the design, and I tie off that way too. And then I'll come back in a few minutes with some green thread and do just 2 or 3 maybe lazy daisy stitch leaves around the outside, and we'll have a beautiful little cluster to use up the last of our thread that we sort of overshot when I did my blanket stitch around the cover. So that's all we're doing here, is just showing you how to make a little decorative element with French knots to use up your scrap thread and to sort of embellish as we go. The next step we'll take is very similar to doing the cover. We're going to blanket stitch in this contrast. I love this variegated raspberry pink to go with the print in the cutter quilt. So we're going to use that raspberry again and go around the entire 4 sides of the outside of our little piece of felt that's our needle page. So you're getting the idea with the French knots, right? And if you don't know how to do one, you pull the needle through, you wrap 3 times the tip of your needle, and then put your needle back in exactly where you came out. Before you pull it through, however, you tighten up those loops around the needle and hold it down, hold the thread down with your thumb, as you see me doing, and then you pull it through gently. Again, it's key to relax when you're doing this. If you're making the loops too tight or holding the threads too tight, it's going to be stressful, but it's also going to be hard on your hands, and it won't turn out as well. And as you can see, I'm knotting off on the top, right in the middle of this cluster of knots. I'm doing my tie-off knot right in the middle of it, and then I just bury the knot in the cluster, pop off the rest of the thread, and I've got this lovely little flower. We'll be back in a second to, again, do the green leaves, but I'll probably use this one. This is pretty and bright. And it's a little bit brighter, more acid green than in the print, but it does enhance the print. So now I've done my blanket stitch around my piece of felt. There's my little cluster, and you can see that I did the same thing. I start at the fold so that I can hide that knot when I sew all the pages in. I can hide the knot by sewing it down into the spine. So now here's our serviette. We're going to make an envelope page with our little scrap of cloth napkin. It's a beautiful vintage linen, but it's got this cute little blue stitch around the outside edge. I'm going to cut it down just a little bit so that it fits the book a little better, and I'm going to bind it with these little scraps. These are not more than 1 inch thick. I'm going to cut this one down a little bit in a second because it's a little bit too thick. I like to use pieces about maybe 1 inch thick by the length of the side that we need to cover to bind. What it's doing is just keeping the page on the upper edge here we'll bind that to keep it from fraying. But if you want a frayed edge, you can do that. This is all just little extra things I do to embellish. But as you can see, we need to make an envelope to hold our little goodies. We need to close each side of the page. And again, I'm just going to cut this down really quick to make it fit our little bitty book just a little bit better. And I can also take that fold. I could iron it, I suppose, but it's much easier just to make it fit the page. And I'm going to trim a little bit off here. It's a little bit too wide for our little booklet, our little cutter quilt cover. So I'll take a little bit off here. And then we're going to just bind those outer edges and make our envelope page. So on the page on the side that has the embroidery on it already around the outer edge, I am going to just hand stitch that together. But we take our scrap and we just finger press it in half. I like the raw edge showing, the torn edge showing over the top. And we just finger press that so that our upper edge can fit gently and firmly into the fold. That way we know for sure when we're sewing it down that we're getting an even, we're encasing everything, and there's not going to be pieces that come out and fray. And I do pin this down before I sew, and I check 2 or 3 times to make sure everything is tucked all the way up to that fold. Let's see, let me show you. Here we go. Here's an example of doing, then I just do a running stitch across it, but here's an example of the reverse. I used the scrap binding on the top of the actual envelope and used the trim across the top of our serviette page. This one is a little bit reversed. This binding fabric is going to be across the top instead of across the fold. So yeah, I think I'm going to use this bright acid green. I love this color. And we're going to pin this all in place just to make sure it doesn't shift when we're sewing. I just put a couple of pins in. You can use Wonder Clips, those little clamps that look like clothespins. If you're brave, you might just be fine like English paper piecers do by just doing the work without pinning and just tucking it with your fingers as you go. But I bury my knot in between the layers. And then I'm going to move this out of the way to get us started. There we go. I am going to make a little X at the beginning and the end of our seam. It's decorative, but it also puts a few more stitches in at the beginning and the end of where the pressure on the page is going to be if you're putting things in and out of your pocket. So I like to start with an X. And it's, like I said, a little X or a little cross. It makes a cute little decorative stitch. And then I just do a running stitch down the remaining length of the top of our envelope page, across and through all 3 layers, checking as I go. Happily that it's pinned, and so I'm pretty secure that I'm getting the middle of all 3 layers. And in and out, just a running stitch, really simple. Some people call that a cantha stitch. Running stitch across all 3 layers, across the top of our envelope page, securing. And it, again, we're not going to launder this or wear it, so it doesn't have to be sewn down to the extreme. It just is a decorative element that sort of finishes off our raw edge and adds a little pop of color and embellishment to our project. So our running stitch, I like to gather a whole bunch of threads on my needle, a whole bunch of stitches on my needle as I go, and then pull through. But you can just do 1 stitch at a time. You can do the stab method, which means going down and pulling it through, and then from the back coming up and pulling it through. That's called the stab method. I find it slower, and so I like to just do this running stitch where I gather on several stitches at a time. And then remember, when we get to the end, we're going to do another X. We're going to do another little finish decorative X at the end. So I want to leave some room for that. And then you can see that I've got a little bit, the trim binding piece is a little longer than our edge. We'll just trim those off. We'll snip them off. Again, we're not going to wear this, so it's not critical if there's a little bit of fraying. And I love the tattered look of raw edges in my work, in my little projects like this. I wouldn't do the same if I were building clothing or costumes, excuse me, or quilting, but for these purposes, this little slow stitching fun, it's just great. And so then I do bury my my knot in between the layers and gently tug it through to finish, snip off my thread, and then we'll snip off the extra fabric as well, just sort of equal with the side of our envelope page. And we're, again, this side with the trim stitching on the serviette, I'm just going to tack that down with beige disappearing pearl cotton or sewing thread. But we make our fold, we make our pocket, and now we're going to add that. I'm just going to, like I said, I'm just going to sew that off. We'll pin it to keep it straight, but I'm going to just go back with sewing thread and take care of that. But this side, we're going to add 1 more binding strip, and you're kind of getting the idea, I think. Checking the measurement to make sure that the page is going to be not too big. We can trim off the side if it is, but it looks just right. And we're going to use this pink piece that we cut to just about 1 inch by the length of the side of the envelope page. Again, we're going to fold over the rough edge toward me, outside on top, and finger press it to make that crease so that our loose edge has a place to settle. And there we go. Whoops. Has a place to settle in that crease. And then again, I'm going to make sure this one I'm going to tuck over because I had enough extra, and it's going to make a little bit more finished edge for us on top. And I'll pin that in place. And we'll do the same thing with the embroidery. I'm going to tuck this under and fold that. So now that's sort of a finished side. And then I'm going to do with the acid green, we'll do an X at the top, a running stitch down the side, getting all 3 layers, and then an X at the bottom. And I just want to make sure, work it with my fingers and make sure that the raw edge is in the crease that we finger pressed in the binding strip to make sure we get through all 3 layers and secure everything so it doesn't come apart. And I think you know the rest. Do you want to see me stitch it, or shall I skip ahead? Here's our quilting knot. And our acid green thread. I just love this thread. I love this color. It's a great contrast. And this is another thing we can talk about is design opportunities. Anytime you're tacking something down, think about whether or not you could make this a design opportunity. With a bold contrasting colored thread, you could actually make this be a part of your design, add a pop of color, or a specialty kind of stitch perhaps that makes this a little bit more, besides just using a blending cream thread or a white thread and just doing the stitching, you might as well use this as an opportunity to add a pop of color or a special little, like I said, a design, a specialty stitch or whatever. All of these are design opportunities. And so that's why I'm using my acid green to add a little bit of color to this added strip embellishment, this little binding piece. So we did our X, and now we're just going to do a running stitch all the way down the side. We're going to do another X where the pocket meets the binding right here, just to make sure that that also has a reinforcement. You could do it a different way. You could just do 2 or 3 back stitches. You could do a whip stitch around the outside, catching all 3 layers, but that is a good spot to use a little bit of extra securing, because that's going to be a place of stress when we're taking things in and out of our pocket. So I just like to do a little something extra. We're just going to do another X here. And I encourage you to check the back of your work from time to time to make sure that all of the layers are laying flat, that the binding piece didn't get puckered or whatever, the little binding strip, that everything is neat and tidy so you don't have to take out stitches. There's nothing I like less than ripping out seams, especially when we're working by hand. By machine, sometimes things get carried away and you can't always check everything with the layers down on top of the machine face. But when you're doing it by hand, there's always a way to check. So here we go. We're almost done. I don't often make videos this long because I tend to like 15 minutes as a target, but this was a completed project with pages and all kinds of other things too. So I'm just rattling on, and I could cut sections of this, but I'm finding things to tell you. I hope that you find them effective and interesting instead of just rambling, because as I do, I am known to ramble. I'm a talker. Okay, so here we finished our X, and we're going to just tie that off. Again, I'm going to go between these little layers at the end and try to bury my thread where it's sort of hidden between the layers of the binding strip that we folded over. Just sort of nick in there and tie off. And then we'll cut our threads and we'll move on to our next page because we are being really productive. We're now getting to the embellishment phase, which is one of my favorite parts, is sort of the final layer of things, figuring out how we can use our scraps to enhance and embellish the cover, the additional pages, and the inside of the cover. So there's our pocket. Perfect. So now let's see. We could sort these in a pleasing way to figure out, oh, I need to sew up that outside edge. That's right. And I'm going to hide my knot face down, and it'll be in the seam of the spine, so that knot won't show. And there I've gone back in with my remaining acid green thread and made my little leaves for my little flower cluster. I found this other snip of serviette corner that I just like. I'm just going to add that as an extra page. I'm not going to do anything to it. I'm just going to add that as an extra page because I really like it. And right now we're just going to, you've seen that I went in with just some beige thread and I tacked the side of our page. Now I find the spine and I'm going to mark it because we're going to start embellishing and we want to know where our fold is. In a similar way, you know what, that's a little too big, so I'm going to cut around this and just sew the rose motif. I'm going to cut the rose motif out of this little snip of vintage tablecloth, and I'm just going to sew just the rose on. So that way we can still see the pattern in our cutter quilt. I love it. It's so pretty and sweet with the little pink roses and leaves. So this way it's sort of sheer. You'll still see through it, but there'll be this little added embellishment of this rose cut out of like I said, a vintage. This is a manufactured. It's not handwork. It's a manufactured lace tablecloth, but it's old. I would guess it to be 40s, 50s maybe. And there we go. And we'll just sew that down. I'm just going to use construction thread and just pin it in place and tack it all down. But let's pin everything first and see what we're going to do. And make sure I'm auditioning stuff. You can move things around and change its position if it isn't pleasing or if it interrupts the spine. I've cut out around this piece of vintage needlework. It's just a little, it came off of a tablecloth or a table runner. I've got a little medallion cut out of a piece of lace, and here's my little yo-yo in a complementary pink. And then down below this, there's a little piece of a little motif from lace that I cut out, and I'll pin that into place. This is sort of, like I said, sort of auditioning things that, and putting them in positions that work nicely around the spine. And let's see, something for the back. We need something for the back. No, those are not pink enough. There's not enough. I'm very matchy. So this tilde scrap, this 5-inch square of tilde from a charm pack, I'm going to just tear out a little piece of this, and I'll put this down with maybe something over the top of it. Yeah, there's a little pop of extra. Oh, perfect. This is perfect. I'm going to fussy cut around the outside. This is an element from a Kathy Holden fabric. She's a lovely Australian fabric designer that works for Moda and designs beautiful ephemera, ticket stubs and label blanks, and in this case, beautiful butterflies that you can fussy cut out to use in your work. Love her fabrics. So, oh, this is perfect. This is what we'll do. All right. And now let's see. Got to trim this down a little bit. It's a little too big. Do we want it horizontal? Do we want it vertical? This is what you do. You just move things around, trim things, cut things, tear things, and then figure out what makes you happy with the pile of little scraps that you've gathered. And you can make the tiniest little Suffolk puffs, yo-yos. You can add buttons, charms, broken jewelry. You can add little seashells. If you can sew it down, you can add it to your work. Little pieces of twig and stick, interesting bark, dried leaves. Depending on what you're going to do with your piece, you don't want to use something breakable that's going to catch on everything, but obviously within reason. Really fun design opportunities to use all kinds of little bits of things. Beading, you can use beading. Again, a broken bracelet provides a lot of design opportunity. And I'm just going to whip stitch all of this stuff down and attach it, and then come back. Here I am back again. I added this little daisy, which was just a cute little added piece to give some texture to that. And then I added a button, a little vintage button, and just went all the way around the butterfly, and then just tacked everything down in place with just some crochet cotton, some vintage crochet cotton. So here's our cover, embellished the way I love it. And I've got my spine sort of marked. And now we're going to layer all of our pages. I'm going to hide that knot face down in the spine seam and center everything in place. And that seam is going to cover that little bit that hopefully will hide my knot. I'm going to put the pocket face down because I'm going to do that added extra piece of serviette as the center page. And perfect. Line this all up. I'm going to pin everything in place and make so that nothing shifts in the process of sewing it all down, because things do get a little dicey. We're going through now several layers. 3 layers of the quilt piece, 2 layers of the pocket piece, the felt, the wool felt, and the extra serviette. So we're going through, you know, half a dozen layers at any given time. So we want to make sure that everything's pinned in place so that nothing shifts. And we want to try to keep our spine stitches. It's just going to be a running stitch. Again, some people call it a cantha stitch. It's just up and down, in and out. But this time we're going to use the stab method because we want to try to keep our stitches on the spine in a very straight line. And we're checking to make sure that this is in fact center. Yes, it is. Everything looks like it lines up well. So then this time I am not going to use a contrasting. I am going to use my vintage crochet cotton. And again, I think that this piece is going to be long enough. We'll knot it and we'll hide the knot in between the spine layers. We'll kind of separate them where we're going to start at the top and put our knot in and go through. And now at the top and the bottom of the pages, I'm going to do extra stitches because we want to make sure these are the ones that we're going to flip open and put needles in and out of, and perhaps things in and out of pockets. We want to make sure that all of this is a little extra secure. So once I've got my centered, I can take my pin out because I've got my needle up through the center. And again, I'm going to take a few extra stitches just to secure everything. In and out, in and out. And these are just through one layer of the quilt, so they may not even show on the back until we're all lined up and happy with everything. And then the stab method. We're going to go through all layers and try to keep these stitches in a nice tidy line. Little small tiny stitches, very tiny stitches to hold all the layers. And here we go. I come back up from the back, and then because I've got all these layers, I take the tip of my needle and work it around until it lines up. So I'm coming out the back, but I don't pull through until I'm confident that the needle is coming out at the straight line of my binding seam. So again, you take your time, tiny stitches. Again, we're trying to go through all of these layers, and as we come out the back, I want to make sure that where my needle comes out and where the thread comes through, I'm making a straight line top to bottom for our seam, for our binding spine. So it's not complicated. It's just in and out. There's no special magic. There's just in and out. There are loads of ways making signatures. There's all different kinds of ways to do binding. But for a little project like this is secure. It's strong. It keeps our pages in. And it's a fast and fairly simple way to get all of our pages secured. And it also creates this little line of a little binding seam for the fold. I don't necessarily put a closure on my little needle books. You can add a button and a loop at the outer edge to keep it closed. You can add at the spine and this would be the time to put it on, a piece of ribbon or sari silk or a strip of torn just quilter's cotton, long enough to go around the entire little book and make a bow at the opening of the cover. But these are so small that I find that I don't need to. They stay closed. They're fine. They stay in my little to-go bag, and they stay in my kit, and nothing falls out. So I am not going to be doing a closure today. But again, that's a little step that in a few minutes after you get the pages all inserted, that would be the time to add your closure, especially if you were doing a ribbon or sari silk or something in the seam. Now's a good time to put that in. But as you see, we're just working our way down the center fold, which we've marked, and making sure that before we pull the needle out and through, that it's still, through all of those layers, still making a straight line, both top and interior. So we're almost done. And again, I'll remind you, every time you come to a place you can feel that needs some extra reinforcing, like the top and the bottom of the pages, because there'll be extra wear on them as you flip through and pull and take out your pins or take out your needles. I just like to reinforce the top and the bottom of all those pages with extra stitches. And we're almost to the end here, but look at that. It's working out perfectly. And nice and secure because we've made little bitty stitches. Here, I'm just going to do an extra securing stitch. And now we'll finish it off here. And you could use a contrasting thread. I just like this seam to sort of blend in, especially when there's so many layers, things could go wrong. I just like to make sure that I use a blend-in thread In this case, it was sort of this off-white pearl cotton. I'm sorry, crochet cotton. Okay, we're getting to the end here where we're going to just do some reinforced stitches. And once again, I try to bury my knot in between the folds so that it doesn't show. We're going to reinforce around a couple of times right here, I think. There we go. This has been a long video. I'm sorry. But here we go. Now we're going to reinforce a little bit and tie off and bury our knot. And our little book, oopsie, our little needle book is almost finished. And again, the use of this cutter quilt, it's just a way to use something up that's been ruined so it doesn't end up in a landfill or as my dog bed, because my dogs have homemade beds by me. It's a way to use something lovely up and create something new. Here, we buried our knot. We're going to clip that off. Hide my thread. There we go. And let's take a look. Look at that. This is our cute cover. And there's our perfect little seam, our spine, and our little vignettes, our little flowers. Our blanket stitch shows great. Our pockets, our extra page for straight pins perhaps, or just decoration. And then here's our other pocket. Here's our final page of felt and our cover page. Thank you for joining me. This is Beth Maitland from Drama Queen Bee Quilt Studio. See you next time.